As Emilio kind of suggested, this talk basically gives you a sense of what's in my recent book. See, there it is. And so let me say just first a few words about where this book fits into the broader scope of my research interests and what I do, and the audiences that I hope this book will engage with. So, as Emilio said, I'm a historian of science, so I'm a historian who studies the process of science, basically. And my work also intersects with environmental history. So environmental historians also study basically the history of human-environment interactions from a kind of humanities perspective, right? So my research interests really center on the relationship historically between place and science. So at the very broadest level, what I'm interested in are big questions like, how is scientific knowledge something that, ideally is universal, right? How are they in fact produced? How's that knowledge produced in very particular places? So in ecology, field science, right? And second, how is that practice of science, the actual, field practices in this case, how are they shaped by the places in which that work takes place? So after all, field sites, they have their own much larger environmental, cultural, even political history. And the science that's done there is just one part of the history of those places of science. And then finally, also, I'm interested in how do the practices of field science shape both our understandings of nature and the relationships between scientists and between scientists and other people. And so those big questions, although focusing on specific cases, are kind of the broader motivation of this book and of my work in general. So American Tropics, what it does is it explores the relationship between field ecology, the expansion of US political economic hegemony in the Circum-Caribbean region during the 20th century, and then also from an intellectual history kind of standpoint, the emergence of the modern concept of biodiversity, right? And so, to give you a sense from an academic perspective, like what are the four kind of main scholarly literatures that this book is intervening in? First, I'm a historian of science, so as far as where it fits in the history of science is I see it as contributing to the history of the field and environmental sciences. So in history of science, like there's a lot of focus, or historically there's a lot of focus on the history of like physics and things like that. More and more study of history of biology, but still it's a lot of lab biology is what historians tend to have looked at. We need more history of the field sciences, I think, especially climate change, et cetera, right? So, second, it's my intention, as a historian also to connect some literatures that have been kind of oddly distinct. So there's actually a pretty decent literature on the history of science and empire, but that history really looks at kind of like 19th century British science, Darwin on the Beagle. It looks at British, French, Spanish to some degree to science and empire. But the U.S. gets left out of that conversation, partly because historians of science in the United States have been really focused on internal to U.S. Borders, and so I'm trying to kind of link histories of U.S. science with these bigger questions that came up in the history of science and empire that mainly focused on the European empires, right? And also, this book, it fits into a rapidly growing, and if you're not aware of it, I bet people in this room would be interested in the field of Latin American and Caribbean environmental history. Environmental history has long been really focused on the US, but increasingly people are working on the environmental history of Latin America and the Caribbean, including, and where this fits more is about the cultural history and intellectual history of ideas about the tropics and tropicality, as well as the idea of biodiversity. But finally, and most relevant to most people in this audience, I think, is, I do hope that this book speaks to scientists, to ecologists and conservationists. Hopefully it's readable, to people outside of history, right? And can provide some, by providing some deeper historical context to think about field sites and to think about field practices and tropical ecology. I'm hoping that, I can perhaps in some way help with efforts to address the legacies of the history that I'm going to talk about, that I think remain today, and maybe we can talk about this in the form of geographical biases in ecology in general about where ecological fieldwork gets done, and also who does it, the demographic biases and who participates and how in the history or in ecology today, by looking at this history. So that's sort of this is where it stands as far as within my own disciplines, but also broader audiences that I hope that I can reach. But so without further ado, let me give you a better sense of the book, and let me start actually with biodiversity, right? So, there's a little bit offset of some of my text, but that should be okay. Today, obviously, biodiversity, it's a key concept in biology, in international conservation, and using it is like second nature to everybody in this room. It's also worth noting that it's one of the kind of rare things that starts off as sort of like jargon in science, but makes its way out into the broader public, and of course is important in international governance and conservation as well. So we kind of take it for granted in a lot of ways. In a narrow sense, and I'm preaching to the choir here, of course, biodiversity can simply just refer to the number and variety of species in a given area. You can talk about the biodiversity of a particular site, of course, talk about the biodiversity of a region or the entire planet. What I want to draw your attention to is that there's nesting scales in the way that we think about biodiversity in that way, so that they situate this idea kind of situates local species, and then especially the loss of local species, as part of a global biodiversity heritage, right? And in using it, conservationists, since the word is kind of coined, as I'm going to talk about, conservationists have basically argued that it's not just particular wild places, as in national parks, or individual endangered species that are under threat, right? But rather that there's a global crisis facing the very diversity of life on Earth. So biodiversity, from its coinage, has been very successfully framed as a global resource. And it's been so successfully framed as a global resource that I think it's also tempting to see its intellectual history as kind of abstracted from place in a lot of ways. So most historical accounts are when philosophers have talked about the term. They basically have focused on the period since the term biodiversity was coined in 1985, in the run-up toward this conference held in 1986 that was run by the Smithsonian and the National Academies of Science in Washington, D.C. So, it's coined in basically a boardroom in Washington, D.C. This is like kind of the origin story of the term biodiversity. So the term biodiversity has a very recent history, right? Just since 1985, 1986. But of course, as you might start to think and suspect, of course, there's quite direct predecessors. There's an older history of concepts like species diversity that were developed and refined over the course of the 20th century. Of course, you can make older links too in a deeper intellectual history. But over the course of the 20th century, basically in conjunction with efforts to understand the numbers and distribution of species on Earth. And what I'd argue is, in particular, of species in the tropics and in the tropics relationships with temperate zones. So my research on the history of tropical biological fieldwork led me to see some pretty direct connections between the rise of biodiversity as a scientific and conservation keyword, and the development of a very particular set of places and of institutions. So one of my book's core arguments, I've got a list of what all the numbers are at the end if we want to get into the weeds. My book's core argument here is that the concept of biodiversity, which we take for granted as applying anywhere and everywhere, and it's actually rooted in the development of very specific places, biological field stations in the Circum-Caribbean during the 20th century. So beginning at the turn of the century, just as ecology is emerging as a new science, botanists and zoologists began to push for the development of field stations. Field stations where they could do basic research on living tropical organisms in their natural environment. And so by the 1920s, US scientists had set up a variety of biological stations throughout the region, including these ones. So Harvard Station at Soledad in Cuba, near Cienfuegos, the Sincona Station in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, and not pictured here, but the New York Zoological Stations, the New York Zoological Society stations in British Guyana. They were called Callicoon and Cartabo, and then Barrow, Colorado Island, BCI, of course, in Panama, now run by the Smithsonian. So these stations, you know, in the tropics were, in some ways, not too different from field stations in the United States or in Europe. Stations in the temperate zones, like stations in the tropics, played a key role in the rise of experimental biology, so the Marine Biological Lab at Woods Hole in Massachusetts, but also the development of place-based ecological field methods. But there is a way in which these tropical stations are different. You know, the researchers who visit these stations overwhelmingly were foreigners, right? They traveled from comparatively species-poor regions in the temperate zone, and you know, I'd argue that because of this, their experiences working at tropical stations led them to focus, maybe especially, did a lot of different kinds of research, but they tended to start to focus especially on investigations into the ecological and evolutionary causes of the great diversity of species in the tropics. So as places, you know, these Caribbean stations mattered because, as I'll show you, they shaped the research questions and field practices of several generations of US biologists. But you know, to go back to the map, I think it should also be clear, you know, if you're familiar with US and Latin American history, that these places matter for a second and you know, more uncomfortable reason, and that is they're all sites in some way of colonial, US colonial or neo-colonial power. So these sites developed in tandem with the timeline, basically in tandem with the southward expansion of US empire in the 20th century, and with the exploitation of tropical environments and people that went along with it. So, so as I'm going to argue in the talk, you know, the colonial nature of these sites matters for a variety of reasons, or basically three big reasons. First, you know, it structured the relationship between US scientists and Latin American and Caribbean scientists, as well as station laborers, the workforce at these stations, as well as local neighbors of these stations. Second, you know, US power and economic interests also quite literally shaped the landscapes in which these field scientists work. They shaped the landscape that these field stations were located in. And then finally, you know, I think it also matters, I argue in this book, you know, that it matters because it also shapes in some subtle and not so subtle ways the kind of values that are embedded in the modern discourse of biodiversity. So for the remainder of the talk, let me, you know, first start by explaining how biologists at these stations developed place-based practices, what I'm calling place-based practices based on some other folks' works as well, for understanding the diversity of life in the tropics through their work at these field stations. All right, and then I'm going to transition and explore the kind of other side of this that I kind of pointed to just now. That is, you know, how working in place, in this case, also meant, you know, allying with U.S. corporations, with U.S. government agencies that had economic and strategic interests in the region. Right. So to go back to the late 1890s and then in translation in the early 20th century, you know, the emergence of ecology. You know, the main intellectual and professional motivation for establishing field stations, research stations in tropical environments came from the emergence of ecology as a new science in the late 19th century. And, you know, members of the first generation of people who called themselves ecologists, that included, you know, famously Eugenius Warming, Andreas Schimper in Europe, but also maybe less well known, but perhaps some of you know, D.T. McDougall, Forrest Shreve in the United States, who were early presidents of the ESA. made the argument, the revolutionary argument, that in order to understand organisms, you need to study them in the places where they evolved, right? So they need to be studied in their own natural environment. So a plant, growing in a Jamaican, on a Jamaican mountain in a rainforest, right, faces quite different problems of adaptation to humidity, to different changes in temperature, different kinds of seasonality, than a plant that has to survive a Wisconsin winter, right? But it seems pretty obvious to us now that they're interested there in the physical factors of the environment that shaped evolution and ecology, right? So the great differences in temperature, moisture, seasonality that environments in the tropics presented, as opposed to kind of what they were more familiar with in their home countries, as well as this comparatively greater variety of species and kinds of adaptations that they were already aware of based on earlier work. This made the tropics kind of a very attractive place to study for this first generation of ecologists. The relationships between tropical organisms and their environment, and of course among different organisms, they pointed out, really couldn't be reproduced within a laboratory in the temperate zone. You have some ability to control conditions in a laboratory, but you can't fully do that. So in order to study organisms from the tropics, you have to travel to the tropics, is the argument that they need to get outside of temperate zone laboratories. But the other side of this, the flip side of this, is they're also influenced by people like Darwin, Wallace, von Humboldt, and others who wrote about tropical kind of travel in the 19th century and earlier. And so they're influenced by those writers, right, to go and travel to the tropics. But they also argued, the way that those travelers had done this science isn't enough either. So it's not that we just can't study in a laboratory, we also just can't pass through, right? Passing through and collecting isn't enough. The traveling naturalists of previous centuries basically had ransacked the tropical landscape for specimens to bring back to northern metropolitan centers, museums, herbaria, right? But the proponents of this new kind of ecology, right, said what we need is a new kind of institution, field stations, where instead of just collecting, you can study living organisms, right? You can study ecology, physiology, life histories, behavior of living organisms in place and over time. So this is their argument for doing in situ field work. In situ field work at these stations allowed researchers from the United States and from Europe to intensively study living tropical plants and animals in their natural environments, basically for the first time. Right? And what did this look like? So for one thing, working at a station allowed researchers to combine laboratory methods, measurements, with observations outside. So these are some images. Pardon the quality of the images, from Sincona, Jamaica. This was basically the first field station set up by U.S. ecologists on a former British site in Jamaica. And researchers there basically could combine physiological measurements made in fairly controlled indoor conditions, and then compare them to the habits of growth, etc., patterns of where species could be found on the mountain slopes outside the laboratory door, right? So they can combine lab and field at close proximity. And the same was true at Soledad in Cuba. In this case, there was laboratory space, there were experimental and botanical gardens nearby, and then there was, access to a variety of, less developed landscapes that, you could get through a kind of a day trip with your Model T Ford, for example here. A short excursion, kind of field station, maybe didn't have a natural environment right around this field station, but you could get to it a short distance away. So that's one advantage of field stations for the practice of science, right? Is you have multiple kinds of spaces in close proximity to each other, lab and field, or perhaps garden, right? But field stations, it's not just about combining lab and field practices. Focused in situ research also enabled researchers to develop new intensive monitoring and censusing practices in nature. So maybe the most vivid example of this is camera trapping. So where animals take their own photo, right? And today this is obviously a really important tool for verifying the presence of rare or hard to document species. And we think of it, I think a lot of people, even working in the field, think of this as a fairly new kind of technology. But actually, it's not necessarily a new technology. It's actually pioneered on BCI in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, using an actual tripwire. I think you can just see it there. And of course, the little explosion that let the flashlight go off had a little bit more effect on the wildlife at the time, given that technology. But this is an example of the kind of efforts to really document all the species and all the, get a sense of population dynamics as well that were being worked on in places where you could really intensively study in one circumscribed locale of BCI. Camera trapping, along with other new intensive censusing practices, helped to reveal, for example, population fluxes over time, which were particularly significant in tropical environments because there was this assumption that that temperate zone researchers had started with, that tropical forests were ancient, that they were stable and unchanging, and what they found, was there was a lot more dynamism here than they might have expected. So even as this kind of place-based fieldwork allowed biologists to study living organisms and populations, I want to emphasize also that taxonomic studies didn't fall by the wayside. At a temperate station, maybe you could get your faunal and floral list and be done with it, but this is not true at these stations. In fact, it seemed that the closer that biologists looked, the more species they found, even when working in a circumscribed kind of area. So a good example of this is the work of William Beebe. He was a zoologist for the New York Zoological Society, and he founded a whole ton of stations. He didn't always keep them going for very long, but in Guyana, in Venezuela, and Trinidad, he founded a bunch of different stations. In this famous moment that I think really should be seen as a predecessor to modern biodiversity censuses, one day he writes, he decided to sift through basically a pile of detritus found in 4 square feet of rainforest floor. He just basically sweeps it all up. He goes through it trying to find all the tiny organisms that are usually overlooked. He identifies, he doesn't necessarily get all the species names, but he identifies that there are at least 500 different worms, insects, arachnids, just in this small area of forest floor that he's swept up and kind of census. And, he does this mental exercise then. He calculates, what this would mean for the vast number of unknown species that then would be in a square mile of rainforest floor, or then let alone, he extends it with, in the whole of the Amazon basin, what unknown species are there. So he does this mental exercise. He doesn't himself try to actually complete such a census. Some of his taxonomic work is criticized and things like that. But he's doing some thinking that I think we should connect up to our understanding of biodiversity. He compared his plot, that plot of forest flora that he took, with similar samples that he took in temperate forests, and he notes basically a latitudinal diversity gradient. But he doesn't go from there to actually construct any kind of rigorous mathematical model or anything like descriptive work. But what's important here is that after World War II, this really changes in ecology, as you might be aware, right? In the 1950s, throughout biology as a whole, there's an importation of kind of like physical science perspectives, of new kinds of experimental work, and especially quantitative approaches come to really increasingly dominate biological science as a whole, but also ecology. And what you might expect from this is, say, a retreat to laboratory science, or at least maybe to relatively simple species-poor environments, like Arctic studies, for example. And that, of course, does happen in the 50s and 60s. But what I'd argue is that the rise of quantitative population biology, of systems ecology after World War II, is actually connected to an explosion of tropical field research. Maybe this is not a new argument to people in this room, but in general, that move has been overlooked, I think, in historical perspectives. So it's in this context that species diversity, the most immediate intellectual predecessor to biodiversity, really emerged as a central theoretical concern for biologists. So working at some of the stations that I listed already, older stations, as well as new ones in Costa Rica, extensions of ones in Panama, in Puerto Rico, in Brazil. Biologists, famous names, in this room famous, like Robert MacArthur, like H.T. Odum, whose papers I just looked at this morning, and Theodosia Stopjanski. They began to use species diversity as really a quantitative index, right? Basically capturing tropical life in a number that could be measured and it could be modeled, right? In this way, you can think of them as kind of cutting through the complexity of tropical environments by studying a few, mathematical variables, studying species diversity in relationship to foliage height, in this case, or to island size, right, as MacArthur famously does shortly after this, or solar radiation, for example, as Odum does. So rather than, it's a big difference from the kind of work that was done in the first half of the 20th century, and that continues to be done in these sites. But rather than really just focusing on exploring the lives and natural histories of individual species and their complex interactions in a particular place from a natural historical perspective, they formulated new quantitative field techniques and abstract models that allowed researchers to make comparisons among ecological communities within the tropics, to see more of the environmental diversity within the tropics, as well as to compare the tropical communities with those outside of the tropics. So these include things like simplified forest profile diagrams that you're probably very familiar with, but also things like ecosystem diagrams that Odum pioneers, right? By the 1960s, these tropical studies, I'll just say that these things really abstract from place in a lot of ways. So you might look at this and have no idea what system it's actually referring to. But some of the work that I do is to really connect up to the field practices themselves in place here. This coming out of Puerto Rico. But in the 1960s, right, tropical studies like these, they start to fuel a new theoretical turn. And I know you can't read all of that, but the point here is that there's just an explosion of publications dealing with that use diversity as an index, that question the ecological and evolutionary mechanisms that actually could explain the patterns of diversity that actually were long observed by naturalists before. So initially, a theoretical abstraction, these indices of species diversity, by the 70s, start to find application quite readily in conservation, partly because they offer a way to a kind of objective tool for making conservation priorities in the world. Like, where are you going to save the environment? Well, where there are the most species that are in danger. But I could go into more detail about that. But my point here is just, at this point, the stage is basically set for the rise of biodiversity and the coining of biodiversity by just compressing biological diversity together for the conference that that kind of started off here with. But let me at this point kind of pause, because for the first half of the talk here, I've kind of intentionally kind of focused somewhat narrowly, on the intellectual and scientific practice side of this story of these field stations. And I've acted kind of as if the ability to access these sites and maintain them was simple or unproblematic in some way. And of course, it was anything but, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the talk. So in fact, for US biologists to maintain these sites that I've mentioned really crucially depended on the provision of land and of patronage from US corporations, from government agencies. So to go back, to go back to these stations that I talked about before, to go back, for example, to Soledad, Harvard Station in Cuba. It's located on a sugar plantation. It was sponsored by the Massachusetts sugar baron Edwin F. Atkins. It began as a sugar experiment station, right, with a very direct economic kind of goal for the station. But only later, through kind of pressure and pleading of the biologists from Harvard who were involved in the project, got it to broaden out to kind of a base for broader biological research. Even Beebe's stations, right, and he really emphasized that his stations were in the wilderness, right, but they're actually located on rubber plantations, right? So, and some of his other stations, station in Venezuela on land owned by an oil company, right? So, so he very directly is working with organizations that are exploiting these environments and actually has to move on, when the forests cut around this station. And also, of course, the station at BCI, now part of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, it enjoyed the protection of the U.S. administered Panama Canal Zone. It got travel concessions for visiting researchers from the United Fruit Company, which basically really dominated travel and economics in the region, right? And after all, these stations are not just about scientific practice. They're not concerned simply with accessing tropical nature, but we're concerned with doing so in a way that insulated visitors from what was the real and perceived dangers and discomforts of living in the tropics. So stations were attractive to researchers from the United States, not only because they offered access to nature in the tropics, but also because they were seen to provide a place to work and live in comfort or relative comfort, in health, in safety, right? And so in the early 20th century, this above all meant protection from tropical disease, and questions of like yellow fever and malaria. These were no jokes. A real concern to show that the station was located in an area that was healthy in some way, right? There was less chance of yellow fever. But even into the later 20th century, this still mattered in terms of really convenience, right? At a field station, right, visitors had a lot of other people working with them for them, right? Visitors from the United States who worked at the field station didn't necessarily have to learn Spanish, right? Which they would definitely have to do if they were going to organize their own expedition and work with local people that they kind of hired directly, right? But instead, someone else at BCI here is, cooking and cleaning, maintaining scientific apparatus, actually maintaining continuity of kind of knowledge of how the place operates, and knowledge of the local environment as different visitors come and go. I'd argue that these convenience also, they allowed a lot more researchers to visit these sites, but they also came at a cost. So that working at these institutions, in a lot of ways tended to isolate visiting U.S. researchers from their counterparts within Latin American and Caribbean scientific communities. So at BCI and other U.S.-run stations, U.S. scientists primarily interacted with local laborers, assistants, or technicians. And at BCI, until the late 1950s, they did so under conditions of the racial segregation that the whole canal zone had, right? It was only really if they went out of their way that most U.S. station visitors interacted with their counterparts in Latin American scientific communities. These communities, after all, were located mainly in urban areas, right? At museums and universities, not at the field stations where these U.S. scientists were kind of aiming to go, in rural areas more mostly. So on the whole, U.S. tropical biologists, as they began to call themselves by the mid-20th century, were really, much less concerned with making connections with Latin Americans than they were with securing institutional stability for their stations. And this is in some ways understandable because that was not an easy task, right? A lot of these stations came and went. You may have not heard of some of the stations I listed in the beginning because they don't continue to operate today as field stations. To keep their institutions running, tropical biologists had to maintain connections to streams of funding, which should be familiar to everyone here, transportation, infrastructures, sources of local labor, and especially access to land, right? And they succeeded in doing this not by like carving out a separate space for basic research as apart from applied problems, but rather by developing strategies to link support for basic tropical research to the concerns of US government agencies and corporations that really dominated regional economies and politics during much of this century. So they emphasized, for example, the relevance of ecological research to applied problems in tropical agriculture and tropical medicine. How did they do this? In part, it meant they could argue that they were training a supply of scientists who might go on to work for US companies or government agencies who needed economic botanists or entomologists who had some experience in the tropics, right? And so, for example, Harvard had a field course in the 1950s centered at Soledad. You can get a sense of the station from this cartoon of it. It was an economic botany class. It sometimes included visits to United Fruit Company plantations in Honduras. And this is the course that in 1953, E.O. Wilson, right, first visited the tropics, right? So today, of course, he is one of the most famous still living biologists, and he was in the 80s one of the biggest kind of public champions of biodiversity and talking about biodiversity conservation. And he has this direct connection with the Soledad station in its efforts to train economic botanists, even though he's an entomologist. But perhaps even more significant than besides this argument for creating a kind of supply of tropical biologists was how the relationship to US interests also shaped biologists' rhetoric, right? So US tropical biologists began to argue by the early 60s, right, that, as early as the 1920s, but increasingly until the 60s, that tropical life could kind of itself be seen as a resource, right? Rather than tie their professional concerns to a few economically significant commodity or pest species, like let's focus on bananas and banana diseases, right? Tropical biologists instead, framed the large numbers of unknown tropical species that Raby wrote about, for example, and their complex, little-studied ecologies as itself maybe the most important source of untapped potential in the tropics. And they argued, for example, who could say what new materials or medicines might lie out there undiscovered in the world's rainforest? So we need to study these species in order to, get those resources, and in order to make them part of the world economy, right? Today, I think we're pretty familiar with this rationale for global biodiversity conservation, the idea that there's an answer here in the Amazon or something like that. But I think its roots are much older than the 1980s. Its roots lie in tropical biologists' efforts to secure patronage for their work within a context of, really U.S. hegemony in the Circum-Caribbean in the early to mid 20th century. But, this didn't last forever, right? The geopolitical upheavals of the 1960s meant that these long-standing close ties to U.S. interests suddenly became something of a liability, right? So with the Cuban Revolution, this cut Harvard's ties to its tropical station. There's a wave of nationalism and anti-colonialism that sweeps the Circum-Caribbean and the whole tropical and developing world in the 1960s. And along with the Soledad station, other long-standing sites seem to be threatened from the perspective of U.S. Tropical field scientists. Even the Smithsonian's station at BCI seemed, it was not clear what would happen with that station as Panamanians called for renegotiations of the Canal Zone treaties in the 1960s. So it's in this moment, right, that there's a response, and U.S. tropical biologists come together really for the first time to create new professional societies and new institutions, including OTS, Organization for Tropical Studies, Costa Rica, the ATB, Association for Tropical Biology. It's at this moment, for the first time, really, that there are substantial efforts to really collaborate with Latin American and Caribbean scientists, right? Tropical biologists have long articulated the study of tropical biology in terms of its potential to aid U.S. national and corporate interests in really exploiting tropical environments. But it's at this point that they rapidly shift to emphasize the value of scientific cooperation, of international development, and the conservation of really the region's biodiversity. But they don't use the word biodiversity yet. They're still talking about species diversity. They talk much more about conservation. And then, you know, by the 1980s, we get the more familiar faces, right? As promoted by tropical biologists like Wilson again, Thomas Lovejoy, Peter Raven, Dan Jansen. Biodiversity becomes a powerful rationale for US and international involvement in tropical conservation. You know, these are activities that united many people, but also that have been criticized by activists and scholars in the global South, and most famously Ramchandra Guha, you know, as enabling a new form of green imperialism, enabling social and economic interventions by foreigners in the name of a global biodiversity crisis. And you know, for US scientists who genuinely saw themselves as trying to conserve the places where they worked and places that they cared deeply about, critiques like Guha's could be kind of baffling, right? They don't see themselves as participating in a form of imperialism at all. They're actually trying to save these places. But you know, that kind of response, I think, is much less surprising and can also just be better understood when you place it in a much broader, longer, and more complex history of ecological science and its relationship really to formal and informal empire in the Caribbean during the 20th century. So I need just to end it there. Back with this picture again. You know, in sum, what I'm trying to get at here is that on the one hand, tropical stations enabled place-based research. They enabled a deep knowledge of local ecologies, one that wasn't possible through expeditionary science alone. And at these stations, biologists from the United States came to identify themselves, professionalize as tropical biologists. And they developed an innovative range of new practices for documenting and theorizing the diversity of life in the tropics and globally, right? And these are practices that we really depend on and largely take for granted today. I think that even as we celebrate these achievements, right, and recognize how important they are, it's also important to recognize that these stations made, you know, tropical nature accessible only in certain ways and only really to certain classes of people through much of their history. So, you know, ironically, tropical biology, it's a place-based science, right? It's in there in the name, it's focused on a place. But traditionally, it was practiced by people from outside of that place. And it traditionally, you know, long developed in isolation from local and national scientific communities within the Caribbean and Latin America. So I think this is a situation which many of the people in the room show, you know, is thankfully very gradually, or well, not thankful that it's gradual, but thankfully it's beginning to change, although maybe too gradually. I'm hoping, you know, that by sharing this history, perhaps further change can be fostered by recognizing, you know, the legacies, the historical legacies that remain embedded in how we know and what we know about the global environment. So I'm going to end it there, open it up for questions, discussions. I'm happy to share more details about any one of these sites as well, of course. So thank you. Yeah.